Welcome everyone to this session today on the future frontiers of science and technology. I'm David Gleicher. I'm head of Science and Society programming at the World Economic Forum, and I also lead our young scientist community. It's really my pleasure and honor today to be here with our two panelists, Suchitra Sebastian, who is a condensed matter physicist at Cavendish Laboratory at the University of Cambridge. She's known for her work in quantum materials, high-temperature superconductors, and for the discovery of insulating materials which display simultaneous conduction-like behavior under high magnetic fields. I think we're going to have to unpack that a little bit more during this conversation. And Mandë Holford, who is an associate professor in chemistry at Hunter College with scientific appointments at the American Museum of Natural History and the Weill Cornell Medicine College. She studies venom evolution and how venomous snail peptides can be used to treat human disease and disorders for pain and cancer. Thank you, Suchitra and Mandë, for being here with us. I can also say that they are both alumni of the World Economic Forum Young Scientists community, which brings together rising star researchers under the age of 40 from all around the world to help world leaders think a little bit more like scientists, and hopefully also to help the next generation of scientific leaders to be better world leaders themselves. We are here to discuss the future frontiers of science and technology, and if any of you have been following across the forum's various social media channels these last few days, you'll have seen quite a lot of content about this. The forum has just launched its first annual Future Frontiers work, which comes out of a survey that we conducted over the summer. Any of you who are members of Global Future Councils would have received an invitation to complete this survey, as did our young scientist community. And so we went out to the networks of experts of the forum to ask them, when you survey the frontiers of science, the frontiers of human knowledge, what are the unanswered questions, the areas of research that are most exciting to you? Or what are some of those areas which are most concerning to you? We ended up getting over 660 responses to that survey, and very interestingly found that there was a lot of sort of coherence with what you might expect to be top of mind for experts, also top of mind for the general public. Lots of concerns around AI, the future of machine-human relations, climate change, of course, the future of sustainable energy. But within that data, there was also a number of voices who were saying, you know, what really is exciting me, or what I'm most concerned about, is this issue, this novel issue that we hadn't really seen talked about much. So we wanted to elevate this and bring this out more to our audiences. We for many years have had an emerging technology report. There are many sort of top 10 emerging technology lists out there, and while those are fascinating and important, I think the risk is that if you focus too much on the trends we already know about, it's a bit like driving your car, staring at the car right in front of you. So we wanted to raise our eyes, get that horizon scanning perspective, and talk about these frontier areas which could produce in the future paradigm-shifting knowledge and paradigm-shifting technologies. So we produced this first year's list of 8 frontier areas of science, 4 which we deemed as the most sort of promising, the most exciting areas, and 4 which were the most concerning. And with us today we have 2 of the respondents to the survey who put forward topics that we saw as some of the most promising and exciting areas. So to kick things off, I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit about when you casted your eyes to the frontiers, the horizon of human knowledge, what was it that you found the most exciting?
Sorry, is this on? Yes. I think one of the things that's most concerning right now is the rate at which we're increasingly consuming energy without a very clear view ahead about how to source enough alternative forms of energy to sustain the rate at which our energy consumption is increasing. So actually the session I was just at, there was a statistic that our rate of increasing data consumption is so rapid that by 2040, just computing will consume all the energy we have. So already data centers have a carbon footprint as big as the entire airline industry. Where my research comes into that is that if we look at alternative energy, so of course, alternative energy is something that we are looking at, so solar energy, wind energy. But something that is a bottleneck that isn't often considered is solar energy is, of course, prevalent in the Sahara. Wind energy is offshore in the North Sea. But how do we actually transport that energy to the urban centers where it's consumed the most? So say the greatest density of electricity consumption is in cities such as New York, but these are hundreds of kilometers away, thousands of kilometers away from where alternative energy is sourced, quite unlike coal and oil, which you have small plants which are quite close to where energy is consumed, and transporting it is not a problem. The current AC electricity cables that transport electricity can only carry it over a few hundreds of meters, and any more than that, the loss is too great and they're not stable enough to carry electricity. So we haven't yet got to the point, and the electricity grid is very old, especially in developed countries. In developing countries, they can just create a completely new grid, but especially in developed countries, we have very old technology which can't carry electricity more than a few hundreds of meters before it just loses too much or it's not stable enough. So what I work on is superconductivity. So superconducting materials are materials which carry electricity with absolutely no loss in energy. So we're all familiar with conducting materials. So copper, for instance, makes up a lot of electricity transmission cables. So in these materials, electrons carry electricity, but they bump into each other and they bump into the walls of the crystal, which constitutes these materials. And so that's what makes a loss in energy. The further they travel, the more energy is lost. In these superconducting materials, when you cool them down below a certain special superconducting temperature, the electrons all start becoming aware of each other. So they start pairing up, so you have pairs of electrons instead of single electrons. And below a certain superconducting temperature, they all suddenly lock into perfectly coordinated, coherent motion. So as opposed to above this temperature, where they're all bumping into each other, and there's a lot of loss in energy, once you cool it down below this superconducting temperature, a quantum emergent effect happens where you get a new phenomena of all these electrons emerging into a giant quantum wave, so that from one end of the transmission cable to the other, there's absolutely no loss. And actually, this is not so abstruse in effect. It exists now and is used even now. So in CERN, so the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which you might be familiar with, there's a 22-kilometer large ring that is a superconducting ring. So over that entire enormous distance, every electron is perfectly coordinated with every other electron, and there's absolutely no loss in energy. And similarly, MRI scanners, you put your head into, that's a superconducting ring. So the issue at the moment, so obviously there's an enormous potential, because if we could transport energy without any loss using these materials, we could carry energy from the Sahara to New York or wherever we wanted to. And this would be an enormous solution to one of the bottlenecks in alternative energy, which we are increasingly realizing is approaching a crisis point. These obviously exist, superconducting materials, and why they aren't yet as widely used as they could be is because the superconducting temperature they need to be cooled to is at the moment not that accessible. It's about minus 100 degrees, so you need to cool it down. Yeah, so you need to cool it down for them to work. So what I'm working on at the moment is firstly how to understand these materials, to see what makes them work the way they do in order to make better ones, and also in order to be able to design new superconducting materials, how best to do this. So yeah, that's what I think is one of the most exciting frontiers at the moment.
Share this one. Hi, everyone. So thank you, Dave, for having us here. I'm very excited that, first of all, Venoms didn't end up in the fearsome category, because part of the work of my lab is to try to transform Venom from an agent of fear to one of innovation, prosperity, and hope. Because Venom has the magic. It's a very powerful agent. It transforms, it turns the David and Goliath fight into one of, from a physical warfare to a biochemical warfare, where David always wins. And so you have a snail that eats fish. That's exciting to me. The fact that a snail can eat something as large as its body size and not be bothered, and can even catch the fish to begin with, is a very exciting story. And Venom in particular, I think, is exciting because it not only can be used to explain the origins of biodiversity. More than 15% of the animal biodiversity on the planet is venomous. Why did nature choose that story, and why did nature repeat that story, you know, both in the sea and the deserts and the mountains? They're found venomous animals everywhere. And so why are we having that story, and how can we as humans harness that power to help us in treating human diseases and disorders? Because venom itself is made up of all of these different compounds, each of which has a specific target, and these are the targets that are affected usually when we're talking about diseases like pain and cancer. And so for me, it's exciting that you can take something that nature has made and transform it to something that humans can use. It also tells the bigger story of why we need to protect nature. And so Venom, to me, is a bridge between the scientific world and the human world, and also the economical world, right? And so why I think you should be excited about Venom is because Venom is doing a lot for you. You may not know it yet, but it is. So Venom is not only helping to save lives, and that's the biomedical application when we find new therapies, right? There's a drug on the market currently from the snails that's used to treat pain in HIV and cancer patients, and it's a breakthrough drug because it doesn't target opioids, which has led to this opioid outbreak in the US. It is targeting calcium channels, so a non-addictive route to treating pain. Only possible because we found this snail that is doing this amazing, you know, David and Goliath trick of eating fish. And how does it do that? With these very potent, very specific, very highly powerful compounds in the venom. And then venom also can help us in terms of food security. So when you think of venoms, I want you to think, you know, nature and you. So, you know, food and health are two big areas where venoms can have impact. And they have impact in the food security area in that a lot of venomous animals feed on insects, and they do this naturally. So when we're looking for bioinsecticides, we don't have to go into a lab and cook up some chemical. We can actually just figure out what is the component in the venom that's killing the particular insect that might be affecting a crop. And this is a nature-based, not only drug discovery for health, but nature-based drug discovery for agriculture. And so when we talk again about how we're going to conserve biodiversity and how we're going to address the issues that are affecting nature, and we're heading to this precipice point of we're really getting to a point by 2030 where we have to think about what are we going to do sustainable development of biodiversity on our planet. This is linked to climate change, it's linked to oceans, it's linked to all of the things that, you know, we depend on to breathe and live and do the things that we do. And so when we think about nature-based drugs, venom is an amazing scientific topic that is transdisciplinary, it's global, and it's very, very, very interactive. So I think of it as like a powerful change agent. Not only is it exciting for me to do the science and figure out how venom evolved, and in particular how we can identify new molecules for treating diseases, but venom as a system can help us give us new paradigms for how science can be done, right? Because we can't do venom in a silo. My training's in peptide chemistry. As a chemist, I can't solve all the issues or discover new things that venom is doing without collaboration with an evolutionary biologist, without collaboration with a computational scientist, without collaboration with even physical scientists, right? And so because of what venom is, the nature of the fact that it is such a very potent, complex mixture of all of these different compounds and how it's used, we need to have a transdisciplinary approach to science. And so for me, that's exciting because what it's doing is breaking the silos of how science is done, and it's forcing us to have new models, not only on how we do science, but also how we do science on a global scale. Because again, these animals are everywhere. And so it's an opportunity for every nation to engage in science and technology development, in science and technology capacity building, and in science and technology economies, because venom is very much a means towards profit innovation, I think. And so I think it's an exciting time for nature and venom and you, and science and food and health and economies, and all of those great things.
Thank you. So I definitely want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to limit myself to just 2 follow-up questions for you both. My first question is, superconducting materials were discovered in the 1980s. The Nobel Prizes were handed out. The venom, we've known about venom for even longer than that, much longer than that, right? So why now? What is so exciting in these 2 areas today that you would put this out there as the most interesting, the most exciting, promising frontier area of research? And then the second question after that is just what can we do? What can the business community, government policymakers, civil society, people outside of the scientific community do to help remove any of the obstacles that might be slowing down progress in your areas?
So the first part, why now? Why now is because of technology. So yes, we've known about venom for millions of years, and venomous animals have existed for millennia, right? And so they don't need us to do what they do. We actually need them, and we are learning from them. And so why now is sort of the confluence of 2 things. So we call it venomics. This is the term in science. And what venomics is this confluence of 2 different fields, the venom research and what I call the omic technology, the rise of the omics. It's like, Android movie. So you have genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics. Basically, the technology to do sequencing of DNA and RNA has become cheap and fast and accessible. And so because of that, it's transformed the way in how we study venom. So traditionally, you would need a lot of a particular organism. You need a lot of their crude venom in order to characterize what the component in those venoms are. Now you basically need 1 animal. You need 1 animal and some tissue. And you can do DNA sequencing, you can do RNA sequencing, and if you have some of the crude venom extract, you can do proteomic sequencing. And basically what you're doing is profiling and getting a sort of a code of all of the things that are found in that venom. And once you have that code, you now have a blueprint for what are the components there, and then you can do sort of hypothesis-driven discovery in deciding which of those components you want to target. Instead of in the past, what used to drive venom discovery was size and opportunity. So when you go out on an expedition, you collect as many of the things that you can find, and usually it's the big things that are easy to collect. But now, because of the omics, we don't have to be limited to just the big, easy-to-use traditional animals like snakes and scorpions and spiders, which aren't big but easy because they're ubiquitous to find. We can actually look at very rare things, very small things, sea anemones, tiny snails that I work with. You can look at, bacteria and all of these things that before were very difficult because you didn't have the quantity. So now we can have evolution and diversity be the drivers to help point us in the direction of which sort of organisms we want to study on the tree of life. Again, because venom is found throughout the tree of life, you can do very interesting comparative research to try to understand how venom evolved, what is the origin of biodiversity, and what are the structures as nature has copied over time that's led to the expansion of species that we see on our planet. And so the omics part has really become the key that's made us able to do the technology and also the knowledge base. It's also been the confluence of the fact that Venom requires transdisciplinary science. And right now, science, and you can tell me if you agree with this, at least in my area of science, the silos are breaking down. I'm a chemical biologist, so I got my PhD. And at the time when I was getting my PhD, there were people like, what does that mean? Are you a chemist or you're a biologist? And I'm like, I'm both. I'm a chemist who likes to solve biological questions, right? So I'm a little bit of both. And so for the people who were training me, they were confused. Now you have people who can be both social and natural scientists at the same time. And the silos are breaking because in order for us to advance science, we can't do reductionist science anymore. You can't pigeonhole a problem. You have to look at the whole ecosystem, right? So you have to understand how this animal is and why this animal is in the ecosystem that it is in order to understand how the venom is reacting. A quick example that you guys featured in the video you made is the Gila monster. So the Gila monster is a venomous animal that binge feeds. And when it feeds, it lowers its blood sugar. And so the first breakout drug, one of the big ones that came from that, is a drug that treats diabetes. It's a drug that lowers blood sugar. Because we knew a little bit more about the ecology of the Gila monster, it helped to sort of target what kind of drug we would go after. So without knowing, having ecologists involved and chemists involved and all of those people working in a collaborative team, you don't get to that end product as efficiently as you would. And so the breaking down of the silos of science and the emergence of all of these omics technologies are the two drivers for why phenomics is possible right now. Oh, yeah.
So I think I'm going to try and answer both those questions together a little bit. So why now, and what can business and industry do to help? So I think why now is a lot to do with because we're at a crisis, and often when new technologies come into their own is when there's a crisis. So there's always a timeline between when a discovery is made and when it becomes economically viable, or an economically viable alternative to old technology. And there's always this tension between when does it break even as being cost effective, but in reality it's not going to break even unless there's impetus from policymakers, from governments, from a recognition by society that this is a problem that needs to be tackled. And I think there's very few technologies that have spontaneously become economically viable without there being an investment in them by policymakers, by decision makers. So I think in the first place, there needs to be the recognition we're already at a crisis point. We're so used to consuming enormous amounts of data, of sharing cat videos, of data mining to very effectively. So when we say artificial intelligence, we don't recognize we're data mining thousands of gigabytes of data, and this consumes a lot of energy. We can't keep consuming at this rate unless we figure out how to more sustainably create transport alternative forms of energy. So that's on the one hand, the need for it. On the other side, of course, we're getting better at understanding how superconductors work and in being able to design new superconductors. But at the same time, there needs to be an acknowledgement that this is something that there is support for doing because there is an immense global need to do this, both not just at the applied end, but also at the fundamental end. Because often there's this idea that creating technology is just at the applied end of making something better, making it cheaper. There's this disconnect between the recognition. At the fundamental end, we need to understand the quantum physics of how to make a better superconductor. It's not just about mixing chemicals together and, oh, magically I'm going to come up with some new superconductor just because I drive the application of it. It actually needs a connection between the fundamental quantum physics of why do superconductors work the way they do. We still don't understand that as well as we need to if we were to design a new superconductor. So we need to come at it from both ends, both the engineering end and the fundamental science end. And for both, it needs a recognition that this is a crisis which needs to be addressed. It's not going to spontaneously be addressed by market forces. It needs policy and investment to make it happen. So for instance, the first generation of superconductors work at lower temperatures. And those ones came into existence as an economically viable alternative because CERN needed to be created. So there needed to be a particle accelerator. Every country was investing millions into this. And so they said, we need a superconducting ring. How do we make it happen? We throw money at it and put engineering firms to work on it. And all of a sudden, there was an industry of engineering firms working to make these superconducting, to make a material economically feasible and engineering-wise feasible to make the superconducting ring, and hey presto, it suddenly existed. At the moment with high-temperature superconductors, there are a few companies that work in this area. They're more niche. It's certainly not at the scale it needs to be for this to become economically viable. They're working in sort of a kilometer length cables at that level, whereas really we need hundreds of kilometers length of cables. So that's one issue. The second issue is that in laboratories, again, it's not that mainstream an activity as you would hope it would be to design a new superconductor, because it's quite a high-risk activity. If you have a graduate student and say, okay, great, we're going to go out and design a new superconductor. If you don't, what happens then? So there needs to be a concerted effort to figure out. So what I'm doing, for instance, in my laboratory, we have a plan, we have a method by which we are able to design new superconductors, and that is to take a material that's not superconducting, but is almost there. It has a lot of the properties of superconductor, but it's not quite superconducting. We take this and we press it. We apply a lot of pressure on it, little bit like squeezing something under the tip of a stiletto heel. More pressure than that, closer to the bottom of the ocean, that amount of pressure. So we press a material that's not superconducting, and we've discovered that these materials become superconductors by this method of taking a material that's almost superconducting, pressing it, and discovering it becomes a superconductor. So that's the way in which we actually design new superconductors, but we need many, many more people doing this, new ways of doing this, in order to get to the point where we are actively designing new superconductors. So I think that's where also industry can really partner with academia in scaling up our efforts. So it's not one grad student in one laboratory, but it's really like when Thomas Edison came up with the light bulb. It was an industry of trying many, many, many filaments, from like horse hairs to different types of materials to make a new filament. Really, we need a much more concerted effort, a much more intelligent and much more creative effort at a large scale to create new superconductors.
I wanted to because I forgot the second part, and I think it's important because we're also at a crisis point in biodiversity and conservation. And so what we need from governments and from industry, and when you talk about the new globalization that's going to happen and the idea to make it sustainable and accessible to everyone, when we talk about that in the realms of Venom research, what it means is that we have to make a new deal with nature, basically. We have to have a nature economy. So at its root, Venom sort of intersects human health, it intersects food security, it intersects economies and building sustainable science and technology economies. And again, because venomous animals are found everywhere on the planet, emerging and already developed nations can all have a role in this new deal with nature, right? And so when we have this nature economy, what we're saying actually is we want to live. We want to live beyond 2030. And in order for us to live beyond 2030, we need to engage with nature in much more positive ways. And Venom is a very strong, I think, scientific field for doing so, because it captures the excitement of why science is important and why nature is important, right? And it's something that you can teach to K through 12 students. You can get young children involved. You can get seniors involved. But for governments to get involved, it can help you shape your economies. And investing in discovery-based innovations, because nature is very much discovery-based. There's so much we don't know about, for example, the oceans. We've sent more people to the moon than we've sent to the bottom of the ocean. So there's a lot of discovery that has to happen. And when you talk about investing in science for most governments, they think about the application side, right? And so they want to do the two-step and not the waltz. You have to do the waltz when you're talking about nature. When you're talking about venom science, you have to do the waltz because we don't know anything. And so first you have to find out what's there. And once you know what's there, then you can begin to capitalize on it. And so we need governments to do sort of discovery-based innovation investment. And we need them to do it on a global scale. So you have to be collaborative. We have to have open borders so scientists can travel, so specimens can move about, and we have to have those two things in order for us to, in the new globalization effort, really be sustainable and accessible to everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to go over time just by a few minutes in order to allow for just one or two questions. Did anybody in the audience want to ask a question? We can collect a few in one go and have a maybe short one-breath response to these.
Sorry, you both talked about sort of government financing and sort of pure research financing, but is there a commercial case that can be made so that you can attract private capital financing? Does that happen? Does it make sense? Because that may unlock,
Right.
more avenues. We know governments are constrained,
Right.
and there's only so much philanthropic capital.
Right.
So, do you have a comment on that?
Sure, quick. For the commercial case, for venom research or for nature in general, it's drug discovery. So new drugs, new therapies, and also it's also new things in terms of what nature-based technologies can do. So biotechnologies, new kinds of glues, and all of these things that are possible. Lens for space cameras, lens for cameras here on your phone, lens for satellites in space. So all of those nature-derived sort of discoveries have a commercialization endpoint. And it's sort of, think about CRISPR and gene editing. So CRISPR is exploding right now, and in terms of what we can do. But without the bacteria that led to the gene, that there would be no CRISPR. So you can commercialize at some point, but you have to do the initial investment in order to get there.
Very similar. Yes, so there is scope for commercial investment close to the application end, and some superconducting materials are much closer to the engineering end, where it's a question of moving it up from making 1 kilometer of it to making 10 to 100 kilometers of it. It needs commercial investment in addition to government inputs, is what I would say, because one can't be divorced from the other, the application end and the fundamental end. So I would say it needs both.
One more question in the back
Very quick
there.
question, actually. Building on the private sector question, but what role do you see for private sector, large corporations and business associations to play an advocacy role in an era where we're seeing some horrible anti-science tendencies, where business collectively can stand up for the importance?
Yeah, so I think in the area of superconductivity, absolutely. And I think that's how it happened the first time round with low temperature superconductors. Each company making its own engineering efforts really is more of a cottage industry where they make like kilometer lengths of them. But if everyone collectively lobbied the government and said, if you would like us to make 100-kilometer lengths, we're a collective industry because it helps everyone. Because otherwise companies just go out of business because it's not sustainable for them. So they all got together and said, this is a priority area that as a civilization we need to tackle because it is a crisis. And if you think this is important, then you need to put your money where your mouth is and fund us to work on this area. So I think there's a very powerful case for lobbying and advocacy.
I would agree. It's the same for Venom and nature research in general. If a group of companies went to a government and say, hey, we need to protect this forest because in the long run it's going to lead to our companies being more successful and profitable, I think the government they usually listen to companies more than they listen to scientists. And so we want to be friends. And it would be great if you guys would advocate for, as she was saying, fundamental science and not just the commercial application at the end, but the thing that's going to drive to that innovation has to get the support. Otherwise, we won't get to those innovations.
Great. Well, Mandë, Suchitra, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much to the audience for coming to join us.